Jonah unlocked the door to his remote mountain chalet, expecting silence and dust after months of being away. Instead, a faint warmth greeted him. The air carried the scent of something recent. His brows furrowed as he stepped inside. The fireplace was cold, but the ashes weren't old. A blanket draped over the couch looked too neatly placed. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Placing his bags down quietly, Jonah scanned the room. Nothing appeared stolen, but small details made his skin prickle. A bowl and spoon sat drying on the counter, and there were faint footprints on the wooden floor. He moved carefully, each step deliberate, as he followed the signs deeper into the house. The creak of a floorboard upstairs snapped his attention. Jonah froze, his breath held. Someone was here. Grabbing a walking stick he kept by the door, he climbed the stairs slowly, the sound of his boots muffled by the thick rug. At the top, he stopped to listen. A faint shuffle came from the attic hatch. "Who's there?" Jonah called, his voice steady but firm. There was no reply, only silence. Tightening his grip on the stick, he reached for the attic ladder and pulled it down. It unfolded with a groan. Jonah climbed, his heartbeat loud in his ears. At the top, he peered into the dim attic, lit only by a single window. Two figures were huddled in a corner. A woman, her skin a pale, silvery hue, held a child close. The boy, no older than 6, stared at Jonah with wide, frightened eyes. Both of them were unlike anything Jonah had ever seen. The woman's features were delicate, her hair shimmering like strands of moonlight. The child clung to her, his small hands clutching her arm. "Please, don't hurt us," the woman said. Her voice was soft, shaky, and unfamiliar, as if she struggled with the words. Jonah blinked, lowering the stick. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" The woman's gaze darted to the child, then back to Jonah. "We had nowhere else to go," she said. Her accent was thick, her words halting. "We are hiding." "Hiding? From who?" Jonah asked, his tone less sharp now, curiosity creeping in. She hesitated. "From humans. From them." Jonah's grip on the stick loosened entirely. His rational mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They weren't here to cause trouble. They were terrified. The boy whimpered, clutching the small object to his chest. Jonah caught a glimpse of it, some kind of holographic device displaying a map. His stomach turned as he realized these weren't ordinary squatters. "All right," Jonah said after a long pause, lowering himself onto the attic floor. "You don't have to hide, but you're going to tell me everything." The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the fear didn't leave her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonah had no idea what he'd just stepped into, but he knew his life was about to change. Jonah sat cross-legged on the attic floor, his walking stick resting beside him. He tried to appear calm, though his mind raced with questions. The woman and her child stayed huddled in the corner, their silver-toned skin catching the faint light from the attic window. The boy clung tightly to his mother, his round, wide eyes darting between Jonah and the exit. His small hands gripped what looked like a piece of cloth, possibly a makeshift blanket. Jonah noticed his shoulders trembling. "It's okay," Jonah said softly, holding his hands up to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman studied him carefully, her silvery hair falling across her face as she tilted her head. Her posture relaxed slightly, but her arms stayed protectively around the boy. "Why would you not?" she asked in halting English. Her voice was melodic but uncertain, as if she was testing every word. Jonah frowned, confused by her question. "Why would I? You're not doing anything wrong." The woman exchanged a glance with her son. She took a slow breath and nodded. "We are not from here. Not like you." Jonah already guessed that much. Her appearance alone was enough proof. He nodded and leaned forward slightly, trying not to alarm her. "Where are you from?" She hesitated, Far. A world. Broken now. Her voice grew softer, the weight of her words clear. We had to leave. To survive. Jonah's curiosity grew, but he didn't want to push too hard. You ended up here. In my house. We did not know it was yours, she admitted, guilt flashing across her face. It was safe. Hidden. Warm. Jonah sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He couldn't blame them for seeking shelter, but this situation was far more complicated than he expected. And who are you hiding from? The woman stiffened, her arms tightening around her child. The ones who hunt us. Men in uniforms. Big vehicles. They do not listen. Jonah's stomach twisted. He could picture what she meant. Government agents, soldiers, or worse. If they were looking for her and her son, it would mean trouble for him too. What's your name? Jonah asked, his tone softer now. Meili, she said after a moment, pointing to herself. She gestured to the boy. This is Kiri, my son. Meili and Kiri, Jonah repeated, offering a small smile. I'm Jonah. Kiri's grip on his mother loosened slightly, and he peeked out from behind her arm. Jonah caught a glimpse of his face, curious but still scared. Jonah took a deep breath. All right, Meili, you and Kiri can stay for now. But we need to figure out what to do next. If someone's looking for you. Meili's eyes filled with relief, though her expression remained cautious. Thank you, Jonah, she whispered. As Jonah climbed down the attic ladder, his mind buzzed with possibilities. He didn't know how, but he was determined to help them. Something about Meili and Kiri stirred a deep, unfamiliar sense of responsibility within him. Over the next few days, Jonah did his best to get Meili and Kiri settled. They stayed in the attic for the most part, and Jonah kept his distance, giving them space. But he couldn't ignore the growing curiosity within him. The more he thought about their situation, the more he realized how little he knew about them, or their world. One evening, as Jonah was preparing dinner, Meili came down from the attic. Kiri was still upstairs, playing with small rocks he found outside. Jonah noticed her hesitation as she stood by the doorway, glancing into the kitchen. Would you like to sit? Jonah offered, motioning to the table. I've got food ready. She nodded slowly and took a seat at the table. Her silver hair shimmered faintly under the light. Jonah noticed the way she kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if holding on to something, though he wasn't sure what. Thank you, Meili said quietly, her voice still unsure but softer than before. We don't know how to thank you. Jonah smiled, trying to make her feel more at ease. You don't have to thank me. You just need to tell me what's going on. I want to help, but I need to understand. Meili looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could trust him fully. Finally, she spoke, her words coming more easily now. We came from a place far away. A planet, far from here. It is called Acaris. Jonah leaned in, interested. Acaris. I've never heard of it. Few have, Meili said, her eyes darkening. It was peaceful once. But then, war came. The people there, they turned against each other. Leaders became violent, and many innocent people died. My people were forced to leave. To escape. Jonah's heart went out to her as he listened. That sounds terrible. So you and Kiri just fled? Meili nodded, her eyes downcast. Yes, we didn't have much choice. The war was everywhere. The government. They wanted to control us. We were seen as enemies. Kiri and I barely escaped, and our ship, it was damaged. We had to make an emergency landing here. Jonah frowned, trying to make sense of it all. So you've been hiding ever since? Yes, for many weeks now, Meili said. We had to keep moving. I hoped to find a place where no one would look for us. But she stopped, glancing toward the attic where Kiri was still playing. Jonah followed her gaze, his expression softening. It's okay. I understand, he said. But I still don't understand why you're so afraid of the people chasing you. What do they want? Maylee's gaze hardened, and she clenched her fists. They want to capture us. They want to bring us back, or worse. We are seen as refugees, outcasts. Jonah could hear the pain in her voice. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to help them. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, Jonah said firmly, his voice steady. But I need to know more. How can I protect you both? What should we do? Maylee looked up at him, gratitude and fear mixing in her eyes. We don't know where else to go. But maybe you can help us find a way to fix our ship. We could leave and never be a danger to you. Jonah thought for a moment. Helping them escape was risky, but he couldn't just turn them away. He nodded slowly. I'll help you, he said. We'll figure this out. Maylee's eyes softened with relief, and for the first time since their arrival, Jonah saw a faint, hopeful smile on her face. As the days passed, Jonah began to settle into an unusual routine. The chalet, once a quiet, solitary place, now felt strangely alive with the presence of Maylee and Kiri. They stayed mostly out of sight, keeping to the attic during the day, and only coming down when necessary. Jonah respected their need for privacy, but it wasn't long before he realized how different things were now. Maylee was cautious, but as they spent more time together, she started to open up a little. She helped Jonah around the house, always careful not to overstep. Jonah noticed she had a natural grace. She moved as if everything around her was delicate, her every action calm and measured. Despite her worry about being discovered, there was something strangely comforting about her quiet presence. Kiri, on the other hand, was a handful. The boy was full of energy, always exploring, asking questions, and showing curiosity about everything. He loved to wander the chalet, touching objects Jonah hadn't paid much attention to before. One morning, Jonah found Kiri standing on a chair, trying to reach a book on the top shelf of the bookshelf. No, Jonah said, laughing as he helped the boy down. You're too little for that. Kiri grinned, showing a missing tooth. I want to learn about your world. You have so many things. Jonah smiled, surprised by the boy's interest. I'll teach you what I know, but first, let's eat. You must be hungry. Maylee often stayed by the window during these moments, watching Jonah and Kiri with a mix of gratitude and caution. She was still adjusting to her new life, but she was also starting to trust him more. After a few days of silence, she finally spoke up one evening as they sat around the table together. You're different from the others, she said, her voice soft, but there was a hint of something new in it. Appreciation. Jonah raised an eyebrow. Different how? The others. She paused, her eyes darkening. They do not help. They only take. You give. Jonah felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words, but it also made him uneasy. He had no idea what it had been like for Maylee and Kiri before they arrived at his home, but he knew that trusting humans might not have been easy for them. He wanted to change that, but he was also afraid. If the authorities found them, everything would fall apart. I'm just doing what anyone would do, Jonah replied, trying to keep the conversation light. No one should be left out in the cold, no matter where they come from. Maylee nodded, but her eyes seemed to cloud over again. Jonah knew that the fear still lingered in her mind, even if she was willing to trust him. Over the next few days, Jonah began to teach Kiri about Earth, its animals, plants, and the way humans lived. Kiri was fascinated by the simplest things, like the sound of wind chimes on the porch, or the way Jonah used a hammer to fix a broken chair. The boy mimicked him eagerly, trying to do everything Jonah did. But as Kiri grew more comfortable, Maylee became more distant. She stayed in the attic longer, sometimes not coming down for hours. Jonah couldn't help but feel the weight of her silence. It wasn't just fear of being found. There was something more, a sadness, maybe even guilt. He wondered what had happened to her on her planet, what had made her so closed off. One evening, Jonah finally worked up the courage to ask her about it. Maylee, what happened to you? Tugor people. Her face tightened, and for a moment, Jonah thought she wouldn't answer. But then she looked at him, her expression filled with sorrow. My people, they destroyed each other, she said quietly. Too much greed, too much power. The war, it killed us. Now, there's nothing left. Jonah didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine losing everything like that. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of a history that was too heavy to bear. I'm sorry, Jonah said softly, not knowing how else to comfort her. Meili gave him a small, sad smile. Thank you, but I'm not the only one. There are others like us, lost and hiding. Jonah felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. He knew they weren't the only ones. He had to find a way to help. But as he looked out the window, wondering if he could truly protect them, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days had grown colder, and Jonah felt a chill deeper than just the weather. Every day, he saw Meili's worried glances, the way she would stare out the window for long stretches of time, as if waiting for something. Kiri, however, had grown more comfortable with his new life, running around the chalet and asking Jonah countless questions about the world outside. He had even started helping Jonah with small tasks, fetching firewood, stacking the chairs, and curiously touching anything that wasn't nailed down. But despite the seeming calm, Jonah couldn't ignore the constant unease in the air. Meili was quiet, too quiet, and the way she reacted to the smallest sounds made Jonah anxious. There were times when she would freeze mid-conversation, her eyes darting to the distance, her body tensing as though she were listening for something. Jonah never asked about it directly. He knew it was connected to the danger she had warned him about, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. One morning, as Jonah chopped wood outside, he noticed something odd. A small vehicle had passed by the chalet. It wasn't unusual to see the occasional car in the distance, but this one moved slowly, almost too slowly. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first time he'd seen such a vehicle, and it didn't take long for his mind to make the connection. Military, the unmistakable markings on the side of the vehicle, the kind of markings he'd seen on news stories about government operations, sent a shiver down his spine. He hurried back inside, his breath heavy in his chest. The door creaked as he entered, but he didn't need to look up to know Meili had heard the vehicle too. She stood in the kitchen, her eyes wide, her face pale. They found us, she whispered, almost to herself. Jonah didn't hesitate. He rushed to her side, his voice urgent. We need to move. Now, get Kiri. We can't stay here any longer. Meili nodded, though the fear in her eyes was impossible to hide. I knew they would come. I knew it. She grabbed Kiri's hand, pulling him close. We need to hide. Quickly. Jonah's mind raced. They had to get out of there. But where? The chalet was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, but it wasn't a foolproof hiding spot. He glanced outside the window, watching the vehicle disappear behind the trees. How long before it returned with more people? The clock was ticking. Meili, listen to me, Jonah said, taking a deep breath. I know this place like the back of my hand. There's a cave system about a mile from here. It's safe. No one knows about it, not even the government. Meili's eyes flickered with a mix of doubt and desperation. A cave. Yes, it's a hideout I used when I first came here. We'll go there, stay hidden until we figure something out. It's our best shot. Meili hesitated, glancing toward the attic where Kiri was sitting, watching them. She looked back at Jonah, her face filled with uncertainty. But the ship, we need to fix it. We can't just leave without it. Jonah grabbed her hand, trying to calm her. I'll help you with the ship once we're safe. Right now, we need to get you both out of here. Please, Meili. It's the only option we have. After a long moment, she nodded. You're right. Let's go. Jonah quickly gathered a few essentials, a backpack with food, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, and they moved swiftly through the house, making sure they weren't seen. Kiri, now holding tightly to his mother's hand, looked up at Jonah, trust in his young eyes. As they slipped out the back door, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees ahead seemed still, but something in the air felt different. Every rustle of wind, every snap of a twig, made his heart race faster. They had to get to the cave before the authorities returned, and before Maylee's past caught up with them. With one final look at the chalet, Jonah led them into the woods, hoping they weren't too late. The forest was dense, the trees towering above them, blocking out much of the light. Jonah led Maylee and Kiri along a narrow trail, his boots crunching through the dry leaves and snow. The cold wind cut through the trees, but Jonah barely noticed. His mind was focused entirely on the path ahead, his thoughts a whirlwind of plans, worries, and fear. Maylee kept close behind him, holding Kiri's hand tightly. Kiri, still trusting Jonah completely, walked quietly beside them, his small steps quick and light. The boy seemed unaware of the danger that had followed them, but Maylee's anxiety was palpable. Every rustling branch made her flinch. Every distant noise had her glancing over her shoulder. Jonah could feel the weight of her fear pressing on him. The authorities were looking for them, and there was no telling how long it would take before they caught up. He needed to keep Maylee and Kiri safe, but the situation was getting more dangerous by the minute. After several minutes of walking, Jonah finally stopped. They reached a small clearing in the woods, the place where he had hidden before. The cave he had in mind was nearby, but he needed to make sure they weren't being followed. "We need to be careful," Jonah said, his voice low but firm. "We don't know if they're tracking us yet, but it's better to assume they are. We have to get to the cave without anyone seeing us." Maylee nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "What should we do? We can't keep running forever." Jonah looked around, thinking quickly. There was no way they could keep moving like this for much longer. The authorities were likely combing the area, looking for any sign of them. If they didn't get to the cave soon, they'd be trapped. "I have an idea," Jonah said, his mind racing. "I can create a diversion. I'll lead them away from you and Kiri. That way, you'll have a better chance of getting to the cave without being caught." Maylee's face paled. "No, I won't let you do that. It's too dangerous." Jonah shook his head. "You don't have a choice. We're running out of time. They'll find you if I don't lead them away. It's the only way." Maylee hesitated, fear and doubt written across her face. "But what if?" "I'll be fine," Jonah interrupted, his voice more determined than ever. "I know these woods. I can lose them in the trees. You and Kiri just focus on getting to the cave. I'll catch up once you're safe." Maylee looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. She knew he was right. There was no time left for second-guessing. She placed a hand on Jonah's arm, a silent thank you in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered. Jonah gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I will. Now go." He watched as Maylee and Kiri moved into the trees, disappearing into the thick forest. He waited a few moments, his breath heavy in the cold air. The diversion had to work. They had to get to safety. Jonah took a deep breath and began his trek back down the trail, careful to step lightly, to make no noise. The plan was risky. He knew that, but it was their only chance. He couldn't afford to let Maylee and Kiri be caught, not when they were so close. As he moved deeper into the woods, Jonah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses heightened. The authorities had to be close. He just hoped his plan would give Maylee and Kiri the time they needed. Jonah moved swiftly through the woods, trying to stay hidden. His heart pounded as he heard the faint sound of vehicles in the distance, their engines growling like hungry beasts. The authorities were out there, and they were getting closer. Jonah couldn't afford to be caught now, not when Maylee and Kiri were depending on him. His plan was simple but risky. He would lead them away, create enough of a distraction to confuse their search, and give Maylee and Kiri the time they needed to reach the cave. The trees around him seemed to close in as he moved, branches snapping beneath his boots, but Jonah didn't slow down. Every step had to count. As Jonah reached a small ridge, he glanced behind him and saw the distant shapes of the military vehicles cutting through the forest. The headlights flashed through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Jonah knew they were getting close, and soon they would find Meili and Kiri if he didn't act fast. He took a deep breath and then bolted, making sure his footsteps were heavy and loud. He needed them to hear him, to think he was running. The forest was thick with trees, but Jonah knew it well enough to maneuver through it. He ran, weaving between the trunks and underbrush, making enough noise to draw attention. It didn't take long. Soon, he could hear the sound of footsteps following him, the crunch of boots on the frozen ground. Jonah's heart raced, but he didn't dare look back. He had to stay focused. Suddenly, a voice called out from behind him, sharp and demanding. "Stop right there." The voice was cold, an order he had no intention of obeying. Jonah's eyes darted around, searching for his next move. The last thing he needed was to be cornered. He kept running, pushing himself faster, trying to stay ahead. The soldiers would be on him soon, but he had to get to a clearing. He reached the edge of a small ravine and, without hesitation, leaped over the side, landing hard on the other side. His feet slid on the icy ground, but he caught himself just in time and kept going. Behind him, he could hear the soldiers shouting, getting closer with every step. Jonah's breath came out in heavy bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs. He knew the soldiers were trying to surround him now, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. He dashed deeper into the woods, zigzagging through the trees to make it harder for them to track him. His eyes scanned the area ahead, looking for any way to lose them. As he pushed forward, he noticed a large rock formation up ahead. It wasn't much, but it would give him the cover he needed. Jonah slid behind the rocks, his heart hammering in his chest. He held his breath, trying to listen for any sounds. The soldiers' footsteps grew louder, closer, but they were still unaware of where he was hiding. Jonah's fingers tightened around the rocks, and he waited. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound behind him, and he turned just in time to see two soldiers coming around the corner. Their faces were set in grim determination as they scanned the area, but Jonah didn't move. He couldn't risk being seen now. The soldiers continued searching, unaware that he was only a few feet away. Jonah felt the tension in his body, every muscle ready to spring into action. He needed to buy more time for Meili and Kiri, but he couldn't keep this up forever. Then he heard something. A faint cry, a sound barely audible, but it froze him in place. It was Kiri. Jonah's heart skipped. He couldn't be sure, but it sounded like the boy. Without thinking, Jonah moved, darting into the trees. He couldn't let them find Meili and Kiri. Not now. The soldiers hadn't spotted him yet, but that wouldn't last for long. Jonah took a deep breath and ran toward the sound, ready to do whatever it took to keep them safe. Jonah's heart raced as he sprinted toward the sound, his feet crunching through the snow and leaves. He had to reach Meili and Kiri before the soldiers did. Every second felt like an eternity, and the noise of his own breathing almost drowned out the other sounds in the woods. The faint cries from Kiri were growing clearer now, and Jonah pushed himself harder, ignoring the sharp sting of cold air in his lungs. The soldiers were still behind him, but he couldn't stop now. He had made the decision to draw them away, but the sight of Kiri's cry pierced through his determination. He couldn't leave them in danger. Not like this. Jonah turned sharply and veered off the path, moving deeper into the forest, hoping to confuse the soldiers. He knew the terrain better than they did, and he used that to his advantage. The dense trees and thick underbrush made it hard for the soldiers to keep up, but Jonah wasn't sure how much longer he could stay ahead of them. He needed to get to Meili and Kiri before they were caught. His breath came in fast, ragged gasps as he sprinted through the woods. The ground was uneven, with rocks and branches sticking up out of the snow, But Jonah's focus never wavered. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through him, pushing him to move faster. He was getting closer to the source of the sound. He could hear Kiri now, crying out in fear. Jonah pushed himself even harder, breaking through the final line of trees and into a small clearing. There he saw Meili crouched low beside Kiri, her arms wrapped tightly around him. They were both looking around in panic, trying to stay hidden. Jonah breathed a sigh of relief, but it didn't last long. He knew the soldiers weren't far behind, and their voices were starting to get closer. Meili's eyes locked onto his, filled with fear, and she quickly grabbed Kiri's hand, pulling him up to his feet. Jonah didn't waste any time. "We need to move now," he urged, his voice low but urgent. Meili nodded, and without a word, she followed him as they slipped back into the trees, moving as quickly as they could. Jonah led the way, his mind racing with plans. The cave wasn't far, but they had to be careful. One wrong move, and the soldiers would catch up. Behind them, the sounds of the soldiers grew louder. They were getting closer, and Jonah's mind raced. He needed a distraction, something to keep them from following. But he couldn't risk being caught, and he couldn't let Meili and Kiri get caught either. Suddenly, Jonah stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the area around them. He spotted a large boulder just ahead, half hidden by some thick brush. Without thinking, he motioned for Meili and Kiri to stay down and made his way toward the boulder. He pulled some nearby branches together, creating a makeshift barrier, hoping it would be enough to hide them for a few moments longer. He turned to Meili, his voice steady despite the tension. "Stay here. Don't move unless I say." Meili's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Jonah squeezed her shoulder briefly before he turned and dashed off toward the soldiers' path, staying low and moving quickly through the trees. Jonah's plan was risky, but he had to do it. He had to keep them off the trail. He gathered all his strength and pushed himself forward, making noise as he moved deeper into the forest. The soldiers would think he was still running. They had to follow him. As Jonah ran, he could hear the soldiers shouting, closing in. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he didn't dare look back. The moment he reached the edge of a steep drop, he turned sharply and made a leap, tumbling down the hill to a hidden ravine below. The soldiers' voices faded slightly, and Jonah took a moment to catch his breath, hoping the noise had been enough to mislead them. He had no time to waste. He quickly scrambled back up the other side, keeping his movements silent as he made his way back toward Meili and Kiri. When Jonah finally returned to them, he saw the relief on Meili's face. They had made it, just barely. With the soldiers distracted, they could make it to the cave, but there was no time to rest. Jonah grabbed Meili's hand, pulling her and Kiri with him toward the final stretch. "We're almost there," Jonah whispered, "just a little further." Together, they moved silently through the trees, knowing that safety was just ahead, if they could make it. The cold air bit at Jonah's skin as he moved through the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. The cave was so close, just a little further, but he could already hear the sound of soldiers in the distance. They were still out there, and the risk of being caught was higher than ever. Jonah's thoughts raced as he guided Meili and Kiri through the thick trees, knowing time was running out. Behind them, the soldiers had stopped following. Jonah had made sure of that with the diversion, but he knew they weren't going to give up easily. They would search every inch of the woods until they found Meili and Kiri. Jonah couldn't let that happen. Not now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees began to thin out, and Jonah knew they were close. He could see the rocky outcrop ahead, the entrance to the cave. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to hide them for a while. Jonah turned to Meili and Kiri, his voice calm but firm. "We're almost there. Stay close to me, and don't make any noise." Meili nodded, her face pale with exhaustion, but determination burned in her eyes. Kiri, too, was silent now, clinging to his mother's side. The boy was scared, but he trusted Jonah. The moment they reached the cave, they would be safe. Jonah led them to the cave's entrance, pushing aside the branches and rocks that hid it. It was small, but deep enough for them to hide in for a while. He ushered Meili and Kiri inside, watching as they settled into the shadows, out of sight. Jonah took one last look at the forest before stepping into the cave with them. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but the sound of soldiers moving closer sent a shiver down his spine. The soldiers would be near any moment. They had no more time to waste. "We can't stay here long," Jonah whispered, "but we're safe for now." Meili's eyes filled with gratitude, but there was also a sadness there. "What will we do next?" she asked softly. "What about you?" Jonah hesitated. He had already put them in danger by helping them escape, and now he was the one who might have to make the ultimate sacrifice. He had promised to protect them, but he knew that if the soldiers found him, it would be all over. "I'll keep them away from you," Jonah said quietly. "I'll create another diversion. You and Kiri stay here. I'll draw them out and lead them in the wrong direction." Meili's face paled. "No, I won't let you do that. I can't let you risk your life for us." Jonah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "It's the only way. If I don't lead them away, they'll find you. And I can't let that happen." He looked at Meili and Kiri, feeling a tightness in his chest. He had grown to care about them both more than he ever expected. But he had to do this. He couldn't let them be caught, not after everything they had been through. "I'll be fine," Jonah said, giving Meili a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just stay here, and don't come out unless I say." Meili's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. I understand. Be careful, Jonah." Jonah gave her one last look before stepping out of the cave, his heart heavy. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to protect Meili and Kiri. As he moved deeper into the woods, he could hear the soldiers getting closer, their voices growing louder. Jonah's pulse raced, but he stayed focused. The distraction had to be perfect. He had to buy them enough time to escape. With a final glance back at the cave, Jonah took a deep breath and prepared for what was coming. "You said." Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as he moved deeper into the forest, each step echoing his racing thoughts. The soldiers were closer now, their voices sharper, cutting through the trees like a knife. He couldn't let them find Meili and Kiri. He couldn't let them take them away after everything they had been through. The cave was their only chance, and Jonah had to make sure they stayed hidden. His mind was clear, focused only on one thing, leading the soldiers away from the cave. He had promised Meili that he would protect them, and now he was about to do whatever it took to keep that promise. The plan was simple: create enough noise and confusion to distract the soldiers, give Meili and Kiri the time they needed to escape. It was a dangerous move, but it was the only option left. Jonah moved quietly through the trees, staying low to the ground. The soldiers were closing in, their heavy footsteps crunching on the frozen earth. Jonah could hear them talking, their voices growing louder as they searched for any sign of the fugitives. He knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. With one last deep breath, Jonah broke into a run, making sure his footsteps were loud enough to be heard. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He needed to stay ahead of them, lead them further away from the cave. The soldiers spotted him almost immediately. "There he is," one of them shouted. Jonah's pulse quickened, but he pushed the fear aside. He had to keep running, had to stay one step ahead. He darted through the trees, moving faster, weaving between the trunks to make himself harder to catch. Behind him, the soldiers were shouting, calling for backup. Jonah knew he couldn't outrun them forever. He needed to get them to the old logging road, a place where he could make enough noise to mislead them. It was risky, but it was the best chance he had. Jonah pushed forward, the sound of his own breath filling his ears. As he reached the clearing near the road, he heard the sound of the soldiers getting closer, their footsteps heavier now. Jonah knew he didn't have much time. He grabbed a nearby branch, breaking it off, and threw it as hard as he could into the woods, hoping the noise would make them think he had gone in that direction. The soldiers paused for a moment, looking in the direction of the sound. Jonah seized the opportunity and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the trees. He could hear the soldiers calling out to each other, their voices growing more frantic as they tried to find him. But Jonah was already moving faster, pulling ahead. The minutes felt like hours, and Jonah's body was beginning to ache from the strain. He had to keep going. He couldn't stop now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jonah reached a small ridge, breathing heavily as he ducked behind some rocks. The soldiers were still searching, but they were losing ground. Jonah's heart beat loudly in his chest, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe, to feel the rush of adrenaline leaving his body. But as he looked back toward the cave, he knew the hardest part was over. He had bought them the time they needed. Jonah made his way back toward the cave, moving quietly, but the weight of what he had done settled heavily in his chest. He had helped them escape, but in doing so, he had said goodbye to any hope of returning to his old life. His heart ached as he thought of Maylee and Kiri, safe and hidden for now, but he knew they would be all right. They would make it. As Jonah reached the cave, he saw Maylee standing at the entrance, her face full of worry. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. Jonah smiled weakly, his voice hoarse. "They're gone. You're safe." Maylee rushed to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something Jonah couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jonah took a deep breath, his chest heavy with emotions. "Take care of each other," he said quietly, his voice thick with unspoken words. As he turned to leave, Maylee's voice stopped him. "You're not coming with us." Jonah shook his head, his heart heavy. "No, my place is here. You need to go. You'll be safer." Maylee reached out, taking his hand for a moment. "I won't forget you," she said softly, her eyes full of unshed tears. Jonah smiled, his eyes burning. "I'll never forget you either." With one final look, he turned and disappeared into the woods, his heart heavy, knowing he had done the right thing. He had protected them, and that was all that mattered. The rest of his life, whatever it would be, was now theirs to live. And that, in the end, was enough.